So good morning, everybody. I'm Laura Sutherland, Chair of the PRC in Scotland. I run my own public relations consultancy, Aura, and I'm also founder of the global and PR community PR Fest. A very warm welcome to you all and to our special guest speaker this morning, Shayoni Lynn, who's Director of Lynn PR and also Chair of the PRC in Wales. Today we're going to be discussing how behavioural science can play a key role in campaigns, transforming the nature of how we communicate, using data, insights and an understanding of how human behaviour to appeal to audiences in innovative ways and creating environments where they can thrive. We'll be taking questions at the end, so please use the chat box to send any questions you might have. Over to you, Shay.
Thanks so much, Laura. Thank you everyone for joining us, and people still coming in, over 45 people. So that's great. So many people are interested in behavioral science. Makes me very happy. Thanks for the introduction. So as Laura said, I run Lynn PR. We are a strategic data-driven communications and behavioral science consultancy. I'm also, when I'm not doing my PRCA work, I'm also a fellow of the CIPR. I'm founding member and vice chair of CIPR's Behavioral Insights Interest Group. I know Francis won't have a problem that I'm saying this. I'm sure it's fine. I'm also an associate lecturer at Cardiff University, teaching on the Masters in International PR course. So I'm really pleased you could join us, meet more people. And then I'm going to talk you through just some overview concepts and principles of the science. I'm aware that there's probably going to be a mix of experience and capabilities, so I've tried to keep it quite high level. Lynn PR is a strategic comms consultancy, and we use behavioral science, behavioral insights, behavioral economics, and edge theory to run campaigns and communications programs with organizational impact. Is that better? There we go, you can see the slides now. So we create meaningful campaigns that work, ensuring that audiences pay attention, engage with content, and take action. Sorry. Trying to multitask here. So what are behavioral insights? Let's start with at the basics. So simply put, behavioral insights help unlock how people make decisions. It provides a deeper understanding of the conscious and unconscious motivations that drive decision making, and we'll talk about some of that unconscious decision making in a bit. A behavioral approach to communications can help your audiences adopt more positive behaviors, and it's all about improving lives. And I'm sure we'll have questions about ethics in this talk. So I really want to stress here, it's about improving the lives of communities and individuals. It's also about understanding the user in their local context. So at Lynn PR, our behavioral science approach is designed to strengthen content, to increase the visibility of calls to action, and as I said, to support change programs that are good for audiences. Okay. So in terms of how that applies in communications, we've got a case study, but it's more about understanding where target audiences live, where they're most likely to see content, how they react when they see that content, as well as an understanding of the networks of influence that impact decision making. Questions to ask is, what do you want to achieve, and what's the behavioral aspect to this, and what do you need people to do in order to get to that objective, and then to explore what the barriers to those behavioral what the barriers to that behavior might be. So why aren't people taking action? What's stopping their decision making? Okay. So thinking about application of behavioral science to communications and campaigns, the first port of call, you won't be surprised, is understanding audiences. Understanding audiences is critical to running any effective campaign or comms program. It's important that we use insight, both behavioral and data, to understand who they are, how they will reach a desired outcome. And as I said before, the barriers that exist that might stop audiences from reaching desired outcomes. So by finding out more about our audience's attitudes, habits, and preferences, we can ensure that our communications remain relevant, that they remain meaningful, and that they are optimized to be as effective as possible. Okay. So defining, identifying, and mapping audiences helps us understand them. A strategic approach to audiences means that we can understand the current level of relationships and what. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. So identifying priority audiences, stakeholder groups, helps clarify who can positively or negatively impact our organization and its reputation. And therefore, I always advocate a combination of audience insight and strategic thinking to help build constructive relationships. And that helps us as comms practitioners turn critics into advocates, ensure that the right message reaches the right individual at the right time, and ultimately boost our communications programs to deliver outcomes with organization impact. That's what it's all about. But we also need to think about and understand audience behaviors. And that's what we're all here to discuss today. If we are them in meaningful ways. Can I try and mute people again? Okay. So this is not always about what they do, such as their engagement with us on social feeds or even their responses to calls to action. It is about understanding the unconscious motivations and biases that exist in all of us as a species and the opportunities and the challenges that these present, especially to us as communicators, as public relations practitioners. And the more we understand how our audiences consciously and unconsciously behave, the choices they make, the way they perceive content and communications, the better we'll be able to design environments where they can thrive. These environments are known as choice architecture. We'll hopefully talk about that. I can't remember if I put that in. Okay. So this is David Halpern. You may or may not have heard of him, but he's the chief exec of the Behavioral Insights team, also known as the Nudge Unit. And he said, do we stumble blindly or do we seek to understand these influences and choices? So this is usually great when I do it in a live session. It's not going to work on Zoom, or maybe not, but I guarantee at this point that everyone in the room who's listening to a talk about behavioral science has either been an accidental nudger or that they've nudged themselves. So I will pretend this is a live session and I'll describe a few scenarios and you can reflect whether you've been in that position or not. The warning, I would say that these are all pre-COVID examples, and for people in lockdown, such as myself, it's probably going to be painful. But if you can think about the times before COVID and think about whether you've experienced these instances, feel free to either raise your hand in person or on Zoom or pop into the chat. So scenario one, you've met someone for the first time, and it could be for business or personal reasons. You're in a pub or bar, which is where the best meetings happen, let's be honest. They buy the first round, so you feel inclined to buy the next. Scenario two, you're at a train station or at an airport. Your fellow passenger taps you on the shoulder and asks if you could please keep an eye on their bags whilst they pop to the loo. Now, normally you wouldn't notice, but now you're extra vigilant. And scenario three, you're visiting someplace new, you want to try the local cuisine, you're strolling down this avenue and you stumble across this lovely looking bistro, love the look of it, love the look of the menu. But just to be 100%, you check TripAdvisor for their ranking and you realize that it's quite low. So instead you decide to eat somewhere that features in the top 10 list. If any or all of the scenarios seem familiar, that's because we nudge and are nudged on a daily basis. That's how our brains are wired, and we don't even pause to notice it. So as a human race, we've been nudging each other for as long as we've existed. We're constantly persuading and influencing those around us. However, when it comes to programs and policy, we prefer to view our world through a rational, logical lens. We focus too much on efficiency and not enough on creativity. But the reality is that as a species, we have both conscious and unconscious motivations. So there are things that we do really decisively, such as admitting people into the room, such as filling out a tax form or comparing the merits of two products for overall value. But there are lots and lots of things that we do instinctively, like detecting one object is further away from the other, or understanding sentences in the languages that we speak. So right now I'm speaking to you and I'm hoping that you're not having to really concentrate and understand every single word that's coming out of my mouth. So if that's the case, then why do we have this need to be logical? And the simple answer is that you can never be fired for being logical, right? If you use established economic theory to propose solutions, And economic theory views life through a very narrow, a very rigid lens of what should be versus what is. And that's a whole different conversation. But then if your solutions don't work, the likelihood is that your senior team will understand and shrug it off. And you probably won't attract much blame because you used established economic models. But the opposite of a good idea can also be a good idea. Narrow conventional logic is the natural mode of thinking, but the problem with that is that it will get you to the same place as your competitors. However, testing counterintuitive solutions and catering for irrationality can take you on a real journey with your audiences. So for example, you may or may not know that just by flipping the order of a list may make people behave in a completely different way. Or what if I told you that my previous role as head of comms at Cardiff University, when given the option, our alumni, our graduates, preferred to give us their email address via a letter in the post. It sounds absolutely mad. But we knew that because we tested it, and we had the highest engagement rate in the sector in the UK. We were catering for irrationality. Another example, and this is quite a famous one, if you were in a room of executives that was trying to come up with a new soft drink, that wanted to compete directly with Coca-Cola, how might you advise them as a comms practitioner? You'd probably say that we need the new drink to be tasty, possibly tastier than our competitor Coca-Cola. We need it to be more competitively priced, and we definitely need it packaged in a way that looks like it's value for money. Now, what if I told you a brand did the exact opposite of these things and managed to give Coca-Cola stiff competition? The drink tasted kind of disgusting, and that's a direct quote from the market report. It came in a tiny, tiny can, and it was exorbitantly priced for what it was. You can probably guess which brand I'm talking about is Red Bull. It's a really good example of what happens when you embrace and cater for irrationality. This is a very famous case study that's now studied worldwide by psychologists and behavioral scientists. So how many, I'm sure many of you have, again, how many of you have read this book? Because I can't see you. I'm sure many of you have read this book. If you haven't, I recommend it. This is called the book Nudge. And there's a lot of confusion about what nudge theory is. So it is a subset of behavioral science and really is a suite of tactics to enable better decision-making within audiences by improving their user journeys and their environments and presenting choices in a more streamlined and easy to access format. So nudge theory does not equal behavioral science, but it is a subset of. A nudge is all about opening the door to creating alternative creative options that can be more effective. And to be very clear, nudge approaches avoid closing down choices. It's about creating an environment where we can guide or encourage audience behavior, but without mandating, without forcing, and without instructing. So it pulls from 3 strands of research, nudge theory. You've got experimental psychology that has implications for design and pricing. Social psychology, which is about how others influence our actions and choices. And cognitive psychology, which are our internal thought processes and mental shortcuts that we use to make decisions every day. Nudge is all about introducing a realistic model of human behavior into communications programs. Nudge type approaches could achieve better outcomes at a lower cost and with a greater respect for personal choice. As people, we are very busy and we have very limited attention spans. Our brains are ceaselessly inferring, overlaying, and interpreting new information and memories. So a lot of our decision making is based on inference and cognitive levers and cognitive shortcuts. And sometimes we get this wrong, and therefore people are nudgeable. Nudge theory and wider behavioral science principles can of course be used in communications to start or adopt a new behavior, to stop a damaging behavior, to prevent the adoption of a negative or harmful behavior, to change or to modify existing behavior. So the GovComms service, GCS, outlines how to adopt behavioral science into comms. And of course, as you can imagine, it starts with objective setting. So set out what the communications activity is intending to achieve and analyze what the behavioral aspect of that objective is. Objective should always be smart and focused on outcomes, not outputs, and it should relate to changing attitudes and behaviors. Next, we must ask, what do we want people to do as a result of this? Do we want people to respond to surveys, sign up to activities, attend events? Do we want people to eat healthy, smoke and drink less, exercise more? What do we want them to do, and what are the behavioral aspects to this action? So once you've identified those desired behaviors, your target behaviors, then you can start identifying the barriers that might crop up in the way. Because unless we know what could be stopping people from doing certain things, we won't be able to design interventions or solutions that change behavior. So how do we identify barriers in a systematic way that is consistent and effective? So there's 1,000,001 frameworks to diagnose behavioral barriers. The most common one, and the one you've probably heard of and is used by the GCS, is COM-B. So COM-B model states that either one or more of these aspects affect behavior: capability, opportunity, and motivation. So capability is all about asking, does your target audience have the right skills and knowledge to do what you want them to do? Have they the physical and mental ability to carry out the behavior? Do they know how to do what you're asking them to do? Opportunity is asking, do your audiences have the resources to undertake the behavior? Have they the right systems, the right processes, and the right environment to facilitate this? Have the people around them who will either help or hinder them from carrying this behavior out? And motivation is about, does the audience want to carry out the behavior? Do they believe that they should? Do they have the right habits in place to do so? Most of the barriers are stuck in capability. If you can fix capability and opportunity, motivation follows. So I'm going to quickly move on to a case study. This is the most recent work we've done for the NHS. It's a mental health campaign that we delivered recently during COVID called Free Your Mind. So we all know it's been tough, lots of challenges, but the biggest challenge of lockdown, of consistently changing measures, of new habits being forced down our throats, is that it's having a huge impact on mental health. So our client, the NHS South East London CCG, recognized the risk of rising mental ill health early on and wanted to raise awareness of and engagement with its mental health services and wellbeing resources. This was our brief. We were asked to help raise awareness of, and by that I'm always going to be quantifiable, and we'll talk about that, and engagement with the mental health services. And so we were given a brief like this, as you've probably been given by lots of your clients and your organizations, which aren't very smart, but that's okay. So we use a combination of tactics to make objectives measurable. So for this particular case study, we used social media advertising estimations. We looked at industry benchmarks for healthcare campaigns. We looked at proxy data and insights from previous campaigns to make our business objectives into smart objectives. We also transformed our client needs into behavioral objectives. So we wanted our audiences to visit the campaign microsite when they felt mentally unwell, and we wanted them to discuss any mental health issues with a trusted friend or a family member. So once we established the measurable objectives, we segmented our audiences to ensure our content was relevant and meaningful to each group. This is a very surface level segmentation. You can do lots of deep dives, and we did in the analysis side of it. But this sort of shows it's not just, obviously we know we can't communicate with everyone. We need to have targeted communications. So our approach was to understand the problem within a behavioral context, helping identify target behaviors and providing insights on influences that drive audience decision-making. So we undertook a behavioral diagnosis with the COM-B model to identify the specific barriers that were stopping people from understanding that these services were available and from using these services. And we did also then analyze what cognitive biases might be impairing or impacting on action and decision-making. As a snapshot of some of the biases, some of the cognitive barriers that we came up with that we knew was impacting on audience decision making. A lot of this will span a lot of healthcare issues anyway. So we use the data and behavioral insights to develop a series of key messages to tackle each of the barriers. Now, these probably sound really simple, but they wouldn't have come about had we not done a behavioral diagnosis. And we'll see why in a little while. But our key campaign messages were about, can you spot the signs of mental ill health? Don't ignore your mental health. Talking is important. We've seen that a lot in mental health campaigns, but so is listening. who would you call to discuss your mental health, and what is mental health? So these were the specific behaviors we wanted to encourage, and they were embedded into our campaign messaging. So we developed a strategy for platform awareness that would simplify the user journey and create more effective choice architecture. So a better decision-making environment for our audiences. We obviously developed a microsite. We ensured that we made it as friction-free as possible, taking out as much sludge, which is a whole different concept. Relatable content, we created and tested behaviorally informed content that resonated with our audiences. We produced a cost-effective social strategy to reach our audiences, and we also worked with a lot of partners to ensure that the right traffic was going to the right place. So this is an example of the insights that behavioral insights and how that leads into campaign development. So common theme that we identified was that individuals did not know the difference between good and bad mental health. So were unable to tell whether they were suffering from mental ill health. So the campaign slogan that came out of both the behavioral diagnosis and our test phase was, "Can you spot signs of mental ill health?" This was a super successful message. It resonated against all our groups, and it was really, really popular. That is because it did something that there was a gap in mental health messaging where people haven't really addressed spotting the signs of mental ill health. So we always test all our behavioral hypotheses before we scale up. So in this case, we tested our hypotheses from messages to calls to action to creatives over 2 weeks. And we were targeting residents on a very granular level. They were always randomized. They were conducted online, and we repeated certain trials to ensure that they replicated. You may or may not know, but behavioral science is a huge replication issue. Replication crisis. Just because something works in a certain context has no guarantee will work in another context. So we always need to test so we know that it might work in that particular context. And this is a snapshot of sort of channels that we used. We had a microsite, we used Facebook, we used Instagram, we used YouTube, AdWords, and then Twitter. So what? So what happened as a result of the campaign? This is something I ask myself and my team every single campaign that we deliver. What value or what tangible results did we deliver? And that's all that really matters. So these are our results on a page. There's much more deep dive in this, but as you can tell with the KPIs listed underneath, we smashed all of our KPIs. We reached over 1.4 million residents of a population of 1.9. We generated 2.3% engagement rate that was 3 times higher than the industry average and higher than our own KPI. We also generated a 3.7% engagement rate on Facebook and Instagram. That was 4.5 times higher. 54% of the audiences that went to our microsite engaged with one of the key calls to action. We generated over 20,000 website visits. Interestingly, we connected with 45% of BAME. 44% of the audiences that connected with us on our campaign were from BAME backgrounds. And that's across a median of 39% BAME population across the 6 boroughs that we were working with. And then we also have drive 766 new registration. We had hundreds of people who saved our advert, which showed that they were coming back to the website. We had very high rate of return visitors. We had hundreds of people who accessed a specific part of the site, which was around getting emergency mental health help. So in summary, our campaign, we were able to rise above the noise in a saturated environment. There's a lot of mental health messaging in the environment anyway, more so now in lockdown. And we were able to create meaningful conversations around mental ill health, engaging with residents, and especially with seldom heard groups like BAME or children and young people. And this is hopefully a good case study that will give you food for thought on how to use behavioral science and a behavioral approach to deliver organizational outcomes. Right. Oops. So I'm gonna switch back my camera. That's me done. Any questions? I should probably have kept that slide up which said any questions. Never mind. Any questions?
Thanks, Shay. That was fab. Yeah, so I've got a couple of questions I'll kick off. It might spur on some more conversation. So firstly, the idea of nudge opening up more choices is surely a really good thing for
Yeah.
surely a really good thing for us as practitioners to have in campaigns, so that we're getting more of a widespread sort of feel. Does that happen in all sort of stages? So obviously you've got your testing stages. Can you maybe explain a bit further about how that might translate through the whole process, you know,
Yeah.
from the sort of start research through to delivering on the campaign?
Yeah, so I think the whole thing around behavioral science is always testing, learning, and adapting. Test, learn, adapt. So the test phase gives confidence because you're getting data insights back from your audience that either confirm or deny your hypotheses. And we at Lynn PR are very open for our hypotheses to be wrong. So we don't come in with any prejudices or subjective opinions. We are just there using our knowledge to create a hypothesis, then we test and we let the data tell us whether it works or not. But however, once you scaled up, it's really important to monitor. So we always monitor in real time. We're extremely agile. So we're constantly thinking about how a certain message lands, depending on context. So context makes all the difference. So what might have worked in test phase may absolutely tank as you scaled up. So the key to that and overcoming that is to constantly monitor and be able to shift really quickly.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. And then the other point of, like, well, two things I suppose that go together. Our brains are storing so much information, and also the saturation of messaging. It's about that cut through, and I suppose that's where you know I do data-led work as well, and I think that's where we need to be encouraging more practitioners to work, because the cut through is the most important part of it, particularly as everyone's sitting producing so much stuff.
Yeah, it's salience, right? So in psychology, salience is something that attracts attention. So in order for something to be salient, it has to be relatable, it has to be personalized, it has to be relevant, it has to have contrast, it has to have color, it has to pop, it has to stand out. So that's why testing is really important. So when we use, obviously there are techniques that you can use to make messages more salient, to make content more salient, to make creatives more salient, but then that test phase will tell you whether the salience worked or not. So for Free Your Mind, we tested, I think we ran 7 trials and we tested everything. And most of our hypotheses were confirmed, which was great. But interestingly, when it came to advertising, we tested, so always testing a control versus variant. Our control message, which was how the NHS usually communicates, won. And for me, that was really surprising, given everything else was quite, drastically different to what you might expect from the NHS. But that's what it was. And it won by quite a margin. We kept in the campaign. I did brilliantly. So it's about understanding what makes something salient to an audience. We may never know what the motivation is, but we need to use the data to keep that salience alive.
And that's why a finger in the wind approach does not work.
Instinct is a great thing. Instinct and intuition is a great thing. For many years, I used to think instinct was bad, especially in my early data-driven years. I was very data-focused. And it's only after sort of a maturity with behavioral science I've realized the instinct is great, but it's always about testing.
Yeah, oh, absolutely, yeah. And you talked about the sort of capability and opportunity aspects being a sort of barrier. Would you say that some of that was mindset driven, like of the audience?
As human beings, we have those 3 barriers. So it's just one of many frameworks to diagnose a problem via behavioral lens. So we, if from getting from intent to action, that's the big thing, intent versus action. What might stop us? COMBI is a great model because it's really easy to use. It's quite simplistic and it has really good literature behind it. But we might not be capable to do, and this is us as communicators, us as human beings, we might not be capable of taking a certain action because the environment that we're taking an action is so filled with friction. So for us to, for example, cancel a direct debit or a auto, 1 month free trial, if it wants you to go through 10 million processes, now this is sludge, write a letter in the post, get Santa Claus to sign it, get blood from somewhere, and then you will get your £10 or whatever. That is sludge, and that is a capability issue because we're not capable. Equally, the opportunity might not be there. There might be lots of communities who are digitally excluded who can't take some of the actions we want them to do because our calls to action are all digital. So if you fix the capability and opportunity, motivation usually follows. And motivation is split between sort of automatic motivation, so things that we instinctively are motivated towards, gratified by, and then sort of reflective motivation, where we might be considering sort of the economic model, really considering our choices, pros and cons.
Yeah. And I suppose that comes back to your audience segmentation and your profiling of knowing, like sort of deeply each of the audiences. So one of the things that I thought was kind of like what I used to talk about years ago, but something that's kind of coming back more and more, is the sort of landing page stroke a microsite for different campaigns, and how the UX of that and cutting out the sludge essentially can make it easier for people to register, find information. But if that person isn't necessarily digitally capable, potentially like an older person, for example, or someone that doesn't have access, then there has to be another route for them to be able to take that action, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think we've got always, from landing page and microsite, it's great for analytics. I much prefer having standalone pages that can track the campaign's journey, but it just makes the journey so much better. And it's about, again, choice architecture, creating the right environments for audiences.
Yeah. So I've got some questions here. So Tom is asking, do you have a link to the bluish document? Was it the NHS one, perhaps? Strategic Communication Behavioural?
No, that's a GCS document. So if you do GCS, if you search for, but I'll try and find it for you, but if you search for GCS, behavioural science, it'll come up. Or behavioural science.
He's also asking if they have any other useful resources on behavioural science, anything you'd recommend?
I mean, it's a huge field. It brings in psychology, economics, statistics, data science, cognitive thinking. It's massive. So you can't really compress it all into a box. But I would say starting point, definitely the book Nudge. It's a really simplified version of the original piece of work, which was done by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, called Thinking Fast and Slow. Some people might have read it. That is a beast to get through. But Nudge is a really effective and quick fire read. And then I would definitely say maybe start listening to some podcasts. Katie Milkman does a really good one called Choiceology, which is, I really like it. She gets in lots of different, but there are loads of behavioral science podcasts out there. But yeah, it's finding the sweet spot is not quite there yet. And that's what I think Lynn PR set out to do, is to really fix, blend communications with academic behavioral science disciplines.
Perfect. And Amanda, hi Amanda, she's asking, and I think this is a really good question because I think the answer is yes, but I'll let you answer. Do you think the time is right to look at testing and developing messaging on key crises and risk elements so that they are ready to be used?
Yes, 100%. Can you hear my dog in the background? Sorry. Probably the postie. Yes, 100%. The COVID-19 has proved the importance of behavioral science in response and recovery. Salience of behavioral science is at an all-time high, where people think it's this magic bullet, silver bullet that's going to fix your problems. It won't. So I think balancing expectation with reality, behavioral science is a suite of techniques and understanding of behavior. But if the policy doesn't exist, if the environments don't exist, it's not going to fix a problem. So I think it's about understanding what is achievable. Sometimes that can be done via communications. Sometimes that needs to be done via policy. Sometimes it's just a design issue. So being able to isolate the problem, but behavioral science is definitely a catalyst for change.
And I think that, just sort of adding to that then, that if there are those challenges that you might find, then surely that sort of integrated approach within an organisation will help overcome some of those challenges. Yeah. And I think that's the thing that, as PR practitioners, we're constantly trying to build relationships internally in organizations as well. And as agencies and consultants, we should be encouraging clients to do that internally. So there's a much better approach to like 360-degree view, essentially.
I just want to pick up on Amanda's testing on crisis as well, and just say it's great to be able to test, but I don't know how you would test crisis comms before crisis has happened. So the way you would probably go about doing that is qualitative, where you would get a group of people who are your advocates and your supporters, and you can test some of the messaging against scenarios, or online lab trials where again you've got panel. But I would always caution about qualitative feedback, because especially if people know who we are and we're in a group of people that can see us and hear our views, we tend to provide answers that we think are acceptable or what society expects of us. So sometimes there might be a huge intent to action gap right there. So sorry, the dog's come into the room. So I know, children, I got a dog. So yeah, so always bearing that in mind with qualitative testing is that they may not be ultimately how people think.
There's a couple of other questions in the chat box, but they're not necessarily related to behavioural science stuff. So I'll probably leave them for you guys to discuss yourself in chat. For example, Andrea's asking about a day in the life of PR. That's cool, but if everyone wants to add their own comments to respond to those people, that'd be fab. I would just like to focus on behavioural stuff with Shay just now, because time is limited and we need to squeeze all that good information out of her. So there was a question from Megan as well, which she has just resent. How did you conduct the initial audience research?
Yeah, so COVID delivery is tough, as everyone in this room probably knows. We had 12 weeks to turn the campaign start to finish, which includes research and testing. So because we work with the NHS a lot, we had a lot of institutional knowledge, but we did a very quick fire organizational consultation where we tried to understand the problem via a behavioral lens. We used that and literature review to identify, to establish the target behaviors, to assess the effectiveness of the target behaviors, to understand the barriers, and to be able to come up with the cognitive biases. We use that to then develop hypotheses, ultimately drill down to being the test phase. So we have all of that we think is the problem, but we need to test it. So we use those hypotheses to develop the content, the creatives, everything. We then test it. So we go out to the community. It's an anonymized, randomized data insights. And we use the data to tell us if we were right or wrong. And as I said, out of 6 out of 7 trials, we were right 6 out of 7. Yeah, sorry. One trial, we were the control one.
Okay. Vicky is asking here, what proportion of your budget went into research and insights? We still experience resistance to investment in this. And as part of B, what free insights do you recommend other than Google Analytics? Vicky, that's a really good question, because it is very common for clients to challenge you on not only just the research and insights phase, but even the actual strategy development. They just want tactics a lot of the time. And I think it's really important that we continue to push for this really essential phase at the start, before you put pen to paper on anything. But I'll let Shay respond to that.
We don't do anything without research and insights is the answer. I know it's not what everyone can do. I definitely had to make a case for it when I was in-house. And the way I did it in-house was doing it in steps. So, you know, I'd have this idea and get permission back in the day to try something. We'd get the results back because we were data-driven, use those insights to then inform future work by influencing leaders and showing them, saying, look, let me do this. These were the results. Can I do some more of this? And so building it, educating them step by step. At Lynn PR, so our agency is built on research and insights, and we never sacrifice on that. So we can deliver research and insights in a week, and we can do that in 3 months. So it's about always having that front face to any campaign or project that we do. And we have lots of case studies that show the importance of research and insights. You know, tactics will only get you that far. You won't be able to demonstrate your value at the end of it. You know, if you don't have objectives, evaluations could be retrofitted, as Laura and I often see in award entries that we judge. So, you know, I suppose I'm quite fortunate to be able to claim that when I go into client meetings because of my involvement in the sector. But it can be hard, and I found it very hard when I was at Cardiff University. But it's about sticking to your guns, knowing your audience like the back of your hand, and using data to convince senior leaders.
Okay, perfect. And Grant's asking, the analytics on the CCG work is interesting. Do you ever get clients who are not convinced that behaviour change is that easy?
That's such a good question. Behaviour change isn't easy at all. It's really, really tough. doing it right is even tougher because it's a lot of process and frameworks and methodology that you need to stick to, and it's much easier to be creative and stick out a post or write a blog or do a press release. Because we work with the NHS, clinicians understand behavioral science. Behavioral science is quite integral in medicine, so we don't find that to be too difficult a conversation to have. Yes, but we have clients who expect results immediately, and we've got a particular client right now where I've gone in and I've said, I can't guarantee behavior change. What I can guarantee is behavioral insights. I can give you the insights to help you inform your strategy, but within the time limit that we have in this particular project, I can't guarantee you any change, and I think that's unrealistic. So it's being able to have those conversations, I think, at the outset and setting expectations.
And that comes with trust, respect, and that sort of you're obviously trying to meet expectations at the same time as manage expectations. And that's when, I talk quite a lot about being more brave and being able to say no, or being able to challenge a client, or even challenge the board on certain things. And it's really important because you can't always deliver. Sometimes it's how long is a piece of string. In our own industry, we're trying to change many behaviours and attitudes, and we know it's generational, so we have 10 years to wait potentially. So it's just looking at things like that and being realistic. And I think kind of coming back to your original point of the research and, setting those objectives at the start, being smart with it as well, is going to give you that sort of realistic understanding of what you can and can't achieve in that time frame.
Absolutely. And you do it once, you see the results coming in. And if you compare that to what you did before, that sort of an approach, and you'll see the difference. And that's a proof of concept to take to senior leaders to try and convince them. Yeah,
definitely. We've got another question from Cameron. Do you think that COVID crisis has changed the way that you approach the fundamentals of insight gathering, e.g. the speed of information that is expected to be provided by clients, particularly NHS Health?
Very good question. Yes and no. So we've always even when I was in-house, we were working at speed. I think the COVID crisis has tested us in how we adapt some of this virtually. So Lynn PR is a virtual agency. We've been virtual before COVID, so not so much in terms of team working and how we work with clients, but when we did a piece of work with the NHS last year, we had the luxury of going into the patch and speaking to residents and running focus groups. So that sort of luxury is gone. So it's about how do you adapt and dare I say the word pivot to this online world using virtual technology. I think it's about optimizing what we have. So we have a lot of virtual technology. We have a lot of AI, a lot of really cool tools that can do some of this work for us. And it's about playing to your strengths.
So then that kind of leads in nicely to something you and I talked about briefly at the start of the week, which is AI. We talk a lot about AI in PR right now, and some people are a little bit scared, I think, of the prospect of AI. I'm sure that plenty of people have seen Kerry Sheehan's presentations over the last year or two about how AI is changing, how it's really important that we need to start to look to AI to actually use and help us, essentially. What would you say in terms of how you use AI in behavioural science?
We use AI every day, right, to work in our digital world. We use different types of AI, and we're exposed to AI all the time. So when we do testing online, we're using the AI functionalities to help us run randomized trials. We're not running a full scale RCT where we've got behavioral scientists looking at how to set it up in lab experiments and things like that. So we're using AI to help us randomize and help us avoid some selection bias and things like that. But sometimes AI will lead to selection bias because the AI is created by humans. We have biases. Those biases have been passed on to AIs. We know this. So, replicating trials, looking at the data, confirming numbers, making sure trends are trends and not one-off. So using some of that. So everything we do online, all of us, we're using AI in some way or the other, but we use AI for testing. We use AI for automation. We use AI for even sometimes helping us solve audience reactions. So if, for example, when we were doing the NHS campaign, we were so granular in our targeting and our placements. We found a particular group that we weren't reaching enough. So we used another channel and we let their AI do the placement for us. And that just bumped up our figures. So it's about sometimes letting the AI do the work for you.
Yeah, and using it to your advantage, yeah, definitely. But obviously with AI comes questions around ethics. Obviously being a member of the PRC and the CIPR, you abide by code of conduct and you are ethical in your work. But just for anyone who is maybe on here and who doesn't know what we mean by ethics in AI, do you want to maybe explain just a tiny little bit about how that works with you guys? I
can talk about ethics and behavioral science. I think ethics and AI is definitely Kerry's bag. I've written an article on PR Week recently on Cambridge Analytica, and I'll try and find the link for it, but that does talk about ethics quite a lot. But essentially, like all science, the application is up to us. So science can be used for good and science can be used for bad, which is why I always make a point in everything that we talk about and we do, that we are using behavioral techniques for good, and not for the good of the organization, but the good of the audience. So if there's ever a clash between what the audience might consider as good and what an organization might consider as good, and if there's a clash in that, we would definitely reject a piece of work there. So it's about having a moral compass, an ethical compass, knowing what you're doing will help people's lives, will help improve journeys. You know, if you move away from public sector to private sector, you can use behavioral science to make journeys more effective, to create less friction when trying to cancel direct debits and refunds and things like that. You can use behavioral science to create a better user journey, to design better services that gets people to where they need to go to improve their lives quicker.
Okay, perfect, thank you. 2 more questions here, which should take us up to the hour. Damien says, please could you explain a little more about any future plans for Free Your Mind campaign? Is the next stage to move on from the initial outcomes to understand the changes to lives which you referred to in the main presentation?
Hi, Damien. Damien attends all my talks. Thank you so much, Damien. It's brilliant. And Damien's a very good behavioral scientist as well, currently working at DVSA. So someone that, you know, if anyone's got questions, go to him as well. Yes, we've had interest from NHS England about scaling it up. We are having conversations. Obviously, we're now going back into lockdowns. You know, you've got your tiered system in England. Wales is now going into lockdown on Friday. You know, Scotland is probably going to follow suit, although you guys know better. So yes, mental health is not going away. Mental health crisis is not going away. Lockdown, I mean, there's so many challenges around COVID anyway, which need a behavioral approach. Mental health being a key critical factor, especially as, and I sound like Game of Thrones when I say this, winter is coming. We need to be thinking about how we mitigate some of this by implementing proactive approach, using behavioral science right now. How do you get someone who does not believe they've got a mental health issue to think about their mental health? How do and you transpose that to flu vaccination. So we do lots of campaigns on flu. We're doing it again for the NHS this year. But we have pockets of the over 65s who are convinced that by accessing the flu vaccine is a mark of their own frailty and mortality. So they won't go and access it, even though it's going to help them live longer. So how do you overcome some of those inherent ways of thinking? And that's why I think, I always advise, if you can see a problem, try and get to it as quick as possible. And give yourself more time to test, give yourself more time to design before you need to scale up. So ideally, a flu vaccine campaign should begin in June or even earlier. And the same for the COVID vaccination. That's going to be a huge issue. People think people are going to run in droves to get the vaccine. It's not going to happen, because the longer we live with the risk, the more risk-taking we become. Our perception of risk changes. So I think the next stage of this, Damien, is definitely to try and scale up. That's up to our clients, but equally we're having conversation with lots of other CCGs and trusts about how we can help as they move into winter campaigns.
Perfect. And Leanne was just asking there about, so she commissions comms campaigns. She said that it's sometimes difficult, obviously, to make the case and get the buy-in for the budget. Looking for all future commissioning, I'll be looking to that approach. We'd love to know if any agencies in Scotland are already adopting this approach. Working on a campaign at the moment and working within these frameworks. I would say that lots of us do use the data-led approach. Not necessarily everybody has that sort of healthcare specific experience. But if, you know, Wilma might be able to point in the right direction if it's a particular size of agency you're looking for. Obviously she's here, she's not specifically just working in Wales, she works internationally. I'm a consultant and can help you in certain areas as well. So yeah, there's lots of ways. It's just about kind of communicating, I suppose, what you need if there's a brief there, to put that out. But thank you so much for a great presentation. It's something I've wanted to do for a while because I have frustrations that our industry doesn't use data, that we're not sort of scientifically led from that behaviour approach. And nudge theory, which is fairly new to our industry, but not necessarily to the rest of the wider marketing field, should absolutely be used as and when possible. Testing, I've talked about testing, you know, as an entrepreneur, and going out there and testing ideas and coming back and tweaking them. And I think that's really, really important. And as you say, that gives organizations, clients, that sort of overview to start with, to go back with further tweaks to make and changes to go out there and actually deliver properly robust campaigns and obviously achieve impact. Any parting in words of wisdom you would like to leave with us?
Test, learn, adapt is what I would say. Always go with the data. We have so many biases, each of us. Let's not cloud our communications and content because of our biases that we don't even know we have. So it's always important to go to market and see how communities think about certain interventions or solutions within the context that you're communicating within. And if you have any problems that you think we can help with, we are at lynnpr.co.uk. I'm on Twitter, Shayoni S. Lynn, or Lynn PR's on Lynn PR Ltd. Give us a shout, and you know, happy to have coffees, chats, and just talk about behavioral science, which is basically what I do.
And if anybody wants to drop their Twitter handle in the chat box just now before you go, that would be great, just so that you can all follow each other, carry on the conversation as well. Wilma will be sending out the slides from today in an email probably in the next few days, maybe early next week, and the video from this session will also be on PRCA TV probably by the end of next week as well. But thank you so much for tuning in to another PRCA Scotland event. There will be more coming soon, and thank you again to Shay, our fabulous guest.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for joining.